Okay, I know we already passed this one and moved on that with regard to a couple more things I wanted to say about the salivary glands. Only because it tends to be something that um, gets asked. And that's the what makes up saliva. Saliva is mostly water. That wasn't a guarantee I will ask it. It's just a heads up. It's mostly water, and I mean mostly like 99% water. You also have some electrolytes in there, and you have some buffers. So what this is all electrolytes, buffers to keep the whole oral cavity at a certain pH, helps keep down bacteria. And then also antibodies, enzymes, waste products, and glycoproteins. Glycoproteins are are what give the saliva its lubricating ability. Most of your saliva comes from your submandibular gland, so that deep gland, some out of the parietal, and very little out of the sublingual. But you have all three of them functioning, creating what's mostly fluids. You actually create quite a bit, about 1.5 liters of saliva a day. So a lot of your fluid that you take in that isn't either extra fluid outside the cell or inside the cell, some of it's the saliva. So contents of saliva, mostly water, and then you have enzymes, antibodies, some glycoproteins to actually lubricate food, but also to keep the mouth healthy when food isn't in there, because there's you're ingesting a lot of germs in food. And then the other thing I want to say about the anatomy, so for example, the tongue. What you want to do is make yourself just a general list of what each of those pieces of anatomy do. So I don't want you to get, because I was reading over how much information your book talks about the tongue. I wouldn't get bogged down in the root and the body portion of the tongue, but generally just get down with, it looks like it kind of lists the primary functions of the tongue. So with as we go through, with each of these, that's what you want to be thinking is, what's the general function of this part, until we get into the whole thing about digestion. And so the next one, we are moving on to the tooth. And teeth are in there to actually do the mechanical, to break food apart, that grinding, that chipping, that biting off little pieces with regard to the teeth. And those of you who are going into dental hygiene, you want to pay a much closer attention to teeth than maybe some other people will. But you have the parts of the tooth, the enamel, the outer portion of the tooth, that's that hard surface, the enamel, the dentin. The dentin is the kind of bone-like. It's not bone, but it's kind of bone-like material in the tooth. The gingiva, that's the gums. That's what's actually what I want to say. It's creating the filling the space. So that bacteria, because you ingest a lot of bacteria, and there's a lot of bacteria in your mouth, so that it doesn't get into areas where it can cause damage, like the blood vessel or the nerve. So the parts of the tooth, and then you have different types of teeth, molars, bicuspids, incisors. And then that's in the lower. In the top, you have incisors, bicuspids, and particularly your canines, uniquely your canines with regard to bicuspids, or not with regard to, but the canines. And then you have the molars. So incisors, canines, bicuspids, molars. And that's going from front to back. And then with regard to teeth, we have our initial teeth, our primary teeth. And we lose those primary teeth, and then we have our secondary teeth. And that's, it's again something that is a fact to hold on to, not so much to get to dwell too much on in this class, unless you're thinking of going into dental hygiene. You probably want to dwell on it. I would hope you'd want to dwell on it. I definitely would never ask you the years on average that you lose your teeth, or the years on average that the teeth come in. But it is kind of interesting, and it's listed there. Then moving on to the esophagus. Esophagus is the tube that connects the oral cavity to the stomach. And that's not a direct connection. You actually have something that's going to regulate how fast that food gets into the stomach. We call that a sphincter. And the tube is, you can see that's one of the reasons why I have the slide on it. It's a highly muscular organ. And you have your famous layers. You have your mucosa, your submucosa. You have your muscular layer, and then you have your connective tissue layer, the adventitia. Remember, the adventitia is where you don't have that parietal peritoneum, that parietal layer to connect. You have this adventitia, which is connective tissue that can actually attach that organ to to its surrounding area. Esophagus, you have a propulsive peristalsis that moves food from the oral cavity to the stomach. This this can happen against gravity. You can eat while you're lying down, although it is gravity assisted if you're eating standing up, but it can work without gravity too. I thought this was really cool because you can, again, it was a slide. You can see how the tissues change dramatically there at that sphincter. You have on the left the squamous, stratified squamous of the esophagus, and then on the right what then becomes the stomach and starts to even become the gastric pits there. And then the dividing line between the two is the material that becomes the sphincter. It's actually the gastroesophageal sphincter, or sometimes they call it the cardiac sphincter. The esophageal cardiac sphincter. I think, yeah, your book calls it the esophageal cardiac sphincter. I may be saying that wrong. But I just thought this was nice. It didn't come from your book, but it was interesting. And then the idea of swallowing comes in phases. We call it, your book calls it the swallowing process. The swallowing process, or degglutination. This becomes very important, particularly if you're going to work with elderly or somebody who has, for whatever reason, has swallowing disorders. And many people can have swallowing disorders, not just the elderly. But you start out with, and this isn't quite going to follow your book, but it's going to become pretty close. Your buccal phase, or your buccal phase, whichever way you choose to pronounce that, is the initial, where you have compression of the bolus and against the hard palate, moves from the hard palate to the oral pharynx, and then into the pharynx. And you have actually so they're just listing the buccal phase as the voluntary phase there, mouth to oral pharynx. And then you have the pharyngeal phase, where you have the brainstem coming into play here with the medulla oblongata and the pons, that actually is then going to start controlling it. And this is where, if you have somebody who's had a stroke, or you have CNS deficiencies, particularly brainstem deficiencies of any kind, you can have swallowing disorders and problems with swallowing. Closing of the epiglottis, that thing that always likes to get asked in lab, that flap of skin to make sure that it, quote unquote, goes down the right pipe. Sorry. This is involuntary. So the only thing that's voluntary is from mouth to the oral pharynx. And then the esophageal phase is involuntary also, where you have this peristaltic contraction of the esophagus that we just looked at. And then the last phase that listed by your book is where the bolus enters the stomach. And you do have a sphincter, the lower esophageal sphincter, and this peristaltic activity takes place till you get to the stomach, and then you have these stretch receptors where the bolus is stretching against that sphincter, and that the reaction is for to have it relax and allow the bolus to go in, triggers the opening of the sphincter, and that triggering is a mechanoreceptor. The stomach is the next thing we need to talk about. We've already talked about it a little bit. It seems like it was a while ago, but I explained to you how many layers of muscle. It becomes something to know in terms of the layers, only because I think not only, but I think it's just really amazing. People don't think about how muscular your stomach is. Maybe when you did the dissecting of whatever animal you dissected, you took the stomach out and you noticed, wow, that's really muscular. But you have several layers, a longitudinal, a circular, and then a longitudinal, circular, and then a another layer. You have 3 layers: longitudinal, circular, and then the layer within the mucosa. You have some fibers in the mucosa. Oh, the oblique layer. Longitudinal, circular, and the oblique layer. I'm sorry, I'm missing one. And then what you have inside is this rugae, which allows for expansion of the stomach. You have your lesser curvature, that's the smaller curve on the left, your greater curvature, larger one on the right. The lesser is where you're going to have the lesser omentum attached. The larger is the greater omentum attached. You have a muscular sphincter at the fundus area. That's why they sometimes call it the cardiac esophageal sphincter, because that's the cardia area of the stomach. And then you have an even greater sphincter, the pyloric sphincter, going from the stomach to the duodenal ampulla. So parts of the stomach. I think probably the new thing that we entered in here is the rugae. Also, the parts of the stomach, the general areas of the stomach. One of the reasons why they name the general areas is because stomachs can have problems, sores. You can have ulcers, and they name the ulcers so named by the general area that you find them in. Stomach lining, the gastric pits. We'll be able to get started with the gastric pits on this one, but you have those rugae. And what you're seeing here, it's actually the top on the left, the very top of it. You're seeing that what it looks like kind of a bunch of tubes there. And you have these areas where between the tubes that go down pretty deep, and then again acclimate ourselves. We can see the layers of the alimentary canals, the muscular externa, the submucosa, the mucosa. And in these gastric pits, you have a lining of cells. And that lining of cells is not all the same. You have certain specialized cells embedded in them. And their design is not willy-nilly. Their design is what's going to happen is you're going to have that hydrochloric acid down in there. And we have to make sure that the food goes down there where the hydrochloric acid is, but that hydrochloric acid doesn't really come out and erode the stomach. The stomach is one of those areas of your body that there's a tremendous amount of wear and tear and friction. The cells of the stomach turn over about every week. I mean, that might be a little bit faster than they do, but they turn over very fast because of the amount of friction and the abuse that it takes with regard to acid. So have a look at what those gastric pits look like. One of my next slides, I think we go into a little bit more detail on what you see there. And that's where we'll pick it up. Well, actually, I have a few more seconds here. Many of the cells are mucus producing cells. You have a very, very tight neck, and then as you go on down, you have parietal cells, chief cells, and then G cells. And this is where we'll pick it up on the next one, and we'll talk about each of those cells.